Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today's program brought to you by Liberation75, 3G New York, for Memory 4, how the third generation tells the stories of the Holocaust. My name is Rafi Oblonsky, and I am proud to be the 3G Committee co-chair of Liberation75 alongside my friend Rachael Binder. Liberation75 in Toronto was supposed to be the world's largest gathering to commemorate the 75th anniversary of liberation from the Holocaust. Almost 10,000 people were registered, but COVID-19 forced us to postpone. Rachael and I were planning innovative programming to encourage 3Gs and young adults in Toronto to commit to carrying the memory of the Holocaust in the future. Today's event is just one example of this. We're excited to bring three powerhouse descendant communities together for today's exciting program. We have Canada, the US, and Israel. As a 3G, this event is so important to me. My siblings and I are the grandchildren of 4 Holocaust survivors. I know that they're looking down at us with immense pride for our individual involvement in Holocaust education and memory. I'm a chaperone in the upcoming Toronto March to the Living. I co-founded the Living Legacy Experience here in Toronto, offering young professionals an additional opportunity to travel to Poland with survivors for 1 week if they're unable to attend the Young Adult March of the Living. I've co-staffed the Canadian Young Adult March of the Living in 2016. I spoke at the last General Assembly of the International Auschwitz Committee in 2017 as part of their young adult cohort, and together with Rachael, we have volunteered on countless dinner miracle committees over its 15-year history. As well, this event is super important to me as a father. My son is the 4th generation of 8 Holocaust survivors. This is a huge testament to his papa, the late Bill Gleed of blessed memory, talking about a phoenix rising from the ashes. He would always say, "Hitler, you lost," at every family event. It'll be my son's responsibility to carry the torch of remembrance to future generations, without survivors to share their experience directly with him. It is our job to instill in him the importance of carrying that torch high and for all to see. Thank you for joining us. I pass it off to Rachael Binder.
Thanks, Rafi. Welcome, everyone. As a Toronto-based granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, I know that we have a responsibility to keep the stories alive because it ensures the torch of Holocaust remembrance is lit and shines brightly as we pass on their stories to the next generation. Like Rafi, I've been involved in so many Holocaust education experience programs in Toronto and throughout the globe, including March of the Living and March of Remembrance and Hope, both as a volunteer, chaperone, and a professional. That's actually where I met Ricki, one of the panelists that you'll be meeting shortly. These experiences gave me a foundation to explore my family's history and work with my bubby to share her own testimony that was only recently shared. Now, working outside of the Jewish community, I strive every day to bring my colleagues these invaluable lessons of humanity. As a 3G, I believe that we are in a unique position. We have an incredible connection to the past and must leverage that in order to protect the future. Liberation75 will be taking place again in 2021. Please sign up for updates at liberation75.org. We'll put that in the chat for you. Today's moderator will be Cayle White, who is originally from Toronto and now lives in New York, so she's the perfect person to moderate this global event. And we want to thank Dave Wax, president of 3GNY, who is handling all of our technical direction today. And on behalf of Liberation75 team, I'd like to welcome Cayle White to introduce 3GNY.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to Liberation75, and thank you to all of our viewers. Welcome to Memory Forward, how the third generation tells the stories of the Holocaust. My name is Cayle White, and I'm a board member of 3G New York, and the granddaughter of 2 survivors from Poland. 3G New York is happy to be partnering with Liberation75 on this event, and we look forward to the day when we will all be, God willing, dancing together in person. Thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned, we have an international audience, so welcome to our viewers from Canada, the UK, Europe, the United States, and of course, Eretz Israel. 3G New York was founded by a group of 6 original members in 2005, and our membership now exceeds 2,600. We are an educational nonprofit organization, and we are most proud of our flagship educational program, We Do, which stands for We Educate. This initiative empowers grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to compellingly tell their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and community groups. Since We Do started in 2010, we've trained 250 speakers, visited over 220 classrooms in 84 different schools, and we have reached over 25,000 students in the New York City area. We have a collaborative partnership with the American Society for Yad Vashem's Young Leadership Group, and we are grateful for their support. We Do and 3G New York are a powerful contribution to Holocaust education. As the population of Holocaust survivors declines, we are determined to prevent their stories from being lost with them. In order for us to keep doing this critical work, your support is essential. 3GNY is volunteer-run and relies on donations to keep We Do and many other programs going. Later, we will be posting information about 3GNY in the chat box, so if you would like to make a gift, we would very much appreciate it. Thank you very much for helping us to honor the memories of our grandparents and all of our families, and ensuring that never forget is more than just an empty phrase. So now I'd like to get right into our event. And before I introduce our speakers today, I'd just like to let you know we have assembled here 3 of the finest examples of third-generation Holocaust storytelling in modern media. Rachael Cerrotti from the USA is a third-generation descendant and an award-winning storyteller and educator. In 2019, she released her first podcast, We Share the Same Sky, which was produced for the USC Shoah Foundation. And it tells the story of her decade-long journey to retrace her grandmother's war story. Her forthcoming memoir will be published in the fall of 2021. Dr. Liat Spier-Livny from Israel is a senior lecturer in the Department of Culture at Sapir Academic College and a tutor and course coordinator for the Open University of Israel's Cultural Studies Master's Program. Liat's research focuses on Holocaust commemoration in Israel. She has written 5 books, including the most recent, Remaking Holocaust Memory, which analyzes documentary cinema by 3G descendants in Israel. Ricki Gurwitz from Canada is the writer and co-producer of The Accountant of Auschwitz, her first feature documentary. In 2015, 94-year-old German SS officer Oskar Gröning, nicknamed The Accountant of Auschwitz, was charged with complicity in the murder of over 300,000 Jews at Auschwitz in 1944. The trial made headlines around the world as a frail old man took the stand to face his former victims. So welcome to all 3 of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay. Before we launch into our individual discussions with our guests, I would just like to put forth as a baseline premise that as grandchildren of survivors, we share a common thread as a generation in terms of how we view the Holocaust and how we tell our grandparents' stories. But there are also dramatic differences depending on which country you grew up in and even in the community in which you grew up. So Rachael, I'd like to start with you. Welcome. Did you grow up in a community with other grandchildren of survivors?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I had all my cousins, and for me, you know, my grandmother, the fact that she was a Holocaust survivor was not something that was hidden. It was a very open conversation, at least in my memory. I grew up in inner city Boston, so in general, I was more often than not the only Jewish person, but I did also have a very active Jewish community that we, you know, I went to Hebrew school and Jewish summer camp. So in some situations, yes, and in some situations, no.
Right. And so what made you want to do this?
Well, when I was a college student, I struggled a little bit with the 4-year college life, but I was really dedicated to pursuing photojournalism as a career. And in 2009, I was sort of figuring out what to do. I knew my grandmother was a survivor. I knew that, you know, she was older, and I figured it would be really nice to sit down and tell some stories with her. And those simple storytelling sessions launched me into my career, which has now been over a decade now of working with her story. It's not something I thought was going to happen, and I don't know if I would have signed on if someone said I'd be lost in her story for 10 years following those first conversations, but I'm so incredibly grateful for it. So it was really, for me, the interest in Holocaust history developed from an interest in photojournalism originally.
Okay. And what made you want to do it as a podcast?
Well, so that was brand new, because when I started, you know, going out more professionally to follow my grandmother's story, podcasts were not on my radar. And so back in 2017, Boston's NPR station, WBUR, produced a 3-part multimedia series about my story and a friend and professional collaborator of mine who's the granddaughter of an SS officer. And that was turned into a 3-part podcast series. And it was the first time that I heard my story being told by someone else, but also in audio form. And it was around that time that I connected with USC Shoah Foundation and Stephen Smith, who's the executive director there, and got a hold of my grandmother's testimony, which she had recorded in 1998. And from there, all the pieces came in and pitched a podcast, and we found the funding and said, let's do it. And then I learned how to make a podcast, which was the greatest thing because, I've been recording audio for years, but more with intention to go back to transcribe or write about it. And it turned out it was just such a fantastic format, not only to share with others, but for me to interact with it differently as well.
It's brilliant. And I have to tell people it's a hauntingly beautiful podcast. And I don't want to give away any of the details, but I really encourage everybody to experience it. And so do you want to maybe share a clip with us from the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. All right, let's see here. Just gonna get this sharing, hold tight. So what you're gonna hear now is the first 3 minutes of the show, and you'll see the name of it. So if you're interested, you can find it wherever podcasts are found or on the website. So. She was a custodian, then a nurse, then a teacher. I'm sorry, that was queued up to the wrong place. Here we go.
When the Second World War ended, we were extremely optimistic. That was still even before we heard terrible things that happened in the camps. But we thought that mankind had suffered so much that they would understand that war was not the answer. We had lived to see miracles happen on the sea. And you know, where with me, when I'm standing there at the beach, looking at that water, I see myself on the bottom of that sea. And I think of these thousands of people who try to come over the Mediterranean today and who are at the bottom of the sea. And it is a shame upon our time that we let this catastrophe happen. I don't know how that should be forgiven.
In most ways, my grandmother lived an ordinary life. She had 3 kids, divorced once, married twice. She was a custodian, then a nurse, then a teacher. When her kids graduated high school, she rented out their rooms for extra income. She swam in any water she could, no matter how cold. And she ate fire. She'd do this magic trick where she'd take a match or a birthday candle, light it, and then stick the flame in her mouth to put it out. As a grandmother, she let all us grandchildren make her these disgusting concoctions that she would promise to drink. Turkey fat, milk, hot sauce, orange juice, juice of herring. We pour it all in. Then we'd run over to her, drop a little garnish on top, and in front of all our parents, present her with our cocktail. She'd take the glass and chug it, the whole thing, then hand it back. Anything to make us laugh. Her face looked like mine, but older. In 2010, she died, in her bed, at home, surrounded by her family. It felt like a normal life, a good life, but there was something different about her. In the back of her head, she knew that she shouldn't be here. She could be in a ditch, in a grave, shot in the woods, buried in an unmarked plot of land. She could have sunk to the bottom of the sea. She could have poisoned herself. There were countless ways she would never have stepped foot in the home she died in. The idea haunted her, especially as she lay on her deathbed. She shouldn't be here at all.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a wonderful clip. And just kind of spoiler alert, so you actually started this journey after your grandmother passed away. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, I started these storytelling sessions with her. So essentially I said, we called her Mutti, which means mother in German, and that's what everyone called her. And he said, Mutti, can we sit down? You can tell me your story. And she was like, no, you've heard it before. And I was like, oh, I'm going into journalism. I want to write it all down. And so we started that, and I really had no strong intention. I had no intention of what I was going to do with it. But then after she passed away, she left behind this absolutely stunning archive. So there were photographs and diaries dating back to the wartime period and interwar period even, and there were all types of primary source documents. And I just kind of dubbed myself unofficial family historian and started digitizing everything and got lost in it. And that was about a 4-year-long process, on my bedroom floor in Boston while I was, waitressing and working in the travel industry and photojournalism and whatnot. And then in 2014, I started traveling to retrace her story. And I thought it was going to be 1 year of travel, packed up a backpack and went to Europe. And I haven't really stopped traveling. I really only stopped because of COVID right now. But yeah, and my intention has been to look at her nearly 20 years of statelessness. That's where this started. Was I really was interested in, she was stateless for 17 years, and I wanted to follow and look into all the cultures she had lived in and all the different countries she had lived in, and find a number of the people who intersected with her story, which I did, and ended up moving in with some of them actually.
So what did you learn about your grandmother during this process? And was it also a process of self-discovery and self-exploration for yourself?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I started this when I was 20. I'm 31 now. And her diaries, everything about her life has been what kind of the backdrop to my own life. And I mean, the 20s are such a transformational time for anybody. You just go through so many stages of life so quickly, and learn a lot about yourself in that time. And so everything was sort of in context of my grandmother's story, but also all these people I was meeting because of her story. I would say, like, I walked into their home as a journalist and left as family because they were witnessing, myself figure out my life as well. So absolutely. And I would say in learning about her, something that I've just concluded is that it's an ever-changing story. Like, I think I understand her, and then the world changes in some way, or my life changes in some way, and I find a new diary entry that reads a little bit differently or feels a little differently. And that's, I think, what's keeping me engaged. And I keep saying, if I'm ever a mother or a grandmother one day, I'll read her diary so differently than I read them now. And I think that's really exciting. It's this evolving relevance that lives with her identity.
So do you think overall that 3Gs have a different dynamic between themselves and their grandparents as opposed to 2Gs, and that in a way facilitates our ability to tell their stories?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I don't think that means that 2G aren't able to tell their parents' story in a very compelling way. I just think it's a different story. And my mom, who's sitting in on the Zoom, as is my uncle, I know, who are both my grandmother's children, would probably agree with me. And my mom and I talk about it a lot, and we go into that a bit in the podcast and in my forthcoming book as well. There's a time and distance makes a really big difference in how close you can feel to a story. I don't think I carry as much of the trauma. I absolutely know 3Gs who do not feel that way, though. I think part of it was when my grandmother was telling me her story, she really approached it as this big adventure, and she had the travel bug so hard, as did I. And so the way we spoke about this, it was sometimes like from 30,000 feet up, or what they say, so it really had this different feeling where the trauma was talked about, but that's not what it was about at the end of the day. When she told it to me, it was more about learning how to adapt and take care of yourself, and deal with new situations, especially really difficult situations. But yeah, I think that time and distance makes a huge difference in how you tell a story, certainly.
Right. And where do you see this project going? Do you see this as the launching point for something else, or would you like to go in a totally different direction?
I don't know if I can call it a launching point after 11 years now, but I think that, like I said, I came into the field of Holocaust studies through my interest in journalism and storytelling. Another big part of what I do is work in education. So I've made this effort to take documentary work and turn it into curriculums for the classroom. And I absolutely love doing that. I always say the students I get to work with, and I work with adult education as well as young as 4th grade, the questions they ask keep having me, like, they inspire me to think about my grandmother's story really differently. And so I hope to continue on with that. The podcast comes with curriculums for the classroom, so it's being taught in schools around the country, and those were developed by Echoes and Reflections and USC Shoah Foundation's Eyewitness program. And hopefully more on that, and then the book coming. But yeah, and now currently I still get to work with USC Shoah Foundation as a creative producer, which has been a really wonderful next step for me, because I now get to work with, you know, their 55,000 plus testimonies in their archive, and not just from survivors of the Holocaust, but other genocides as well, and look at, you know, how stories are told from an intergenerational space, and not just stories about the archive, but stories inspired by the archive. And that's been a really natural and transition, and I'm so grateful for it, because those stories also put my grandmother's history in a different context.
Right, that kind of ties into what I was just going to ask you about. How do you see the state of Holocaust education evolving, and how can we integrate more of the technology so that because there's such a vast repository of information that the survivors have left to us, how do we integrate more along with the technology to teach the students of tomorrow?
Yeah, I think Shoah Foundation is a great example of, you know, moving forward with technology. They have lots of different programs going. I think podcasting is great, and there are more and more podcasts I see coming out that tell stories of survivors. But, you know, media is so accessible. We have it in our pockets, in our phones. It's engaging, and I think it's a way for these, you know, stories that young kids are going to feel as old stories, because to them they are, to make them feel new, and to be able to look at them in the context of today. I think a lot of you know, people of my generation that I talk to are yearning to look at their grandparents' history in the present day, through a present day lens. And I think that's really important. So you have to talk about the refugee crisis. You have to talk about how politics are changing. And I think that we're all kind of trying to be really creative and looking for the line of how do you still keep, you know, these stories authentic to what they were and as the survivors told them. But the survivors left us such a gift. There's so many testimonies to work with, and they've done such a good job at recording their story. So I think it's a really exciting time to see how people are using that media to continue telling the story in new and innovative ways.
Right, so just for people who have joined us a little bit late, if you didn't hear the name of the podcast, it's called We Share the Same Sky. And actually on the 3GNY resource page, we will be listing, we will be putting links to this podcast as well as to our other guest material, so you don't have to worry about missing the names. So with that, I just kind of like to thank you, Rachael. I'd like to shift gears a little bit to a different country and a different continent, to Dr. Liat Spier-Livny. Liat, welcome. So you grew up in Israel, and your grandfather was a survivor. Is that correct?
4 of my grandparents were survivors, but first of all, thank you. I feel so much at home here. Finally, people who understand me. So yes, when we talk about Holocaust awareness, for me, it divides between my paternal grandparents and my maternal grandparents, because when we talk about my paternal grandparents, they lived in this small village on the Polish-USSR border. And when the war began, they ran into the USSR. They were deployed to Siberia, and they were among the lucky ones who succeeded to survive. And I'm saying lucky ones because just imagine working hard labor in a gulag in Siberia, 60 degrees below zero, and they are the lucky ones because the vast majority of their village was deported to death. So they never considered themselves Holocaust survivors, and I never heard Holocaust stories from them. And when I turned to my maternal grandparents, my grandmother, Guta, is a Warsaw Ghetto survivor and an Auschwitz survivor, but she died when I was very young. She was very young as well. So I don't recall any Holocaust stories from her. So when I talk about Holocaust awareness for me, or Holocaust stories for me, it is basically the stories of my maternal grandfather, Moshe. Moshe was a large ghetto survivor. He stayed there until the very end, August 1944. Then he was deported to Auschwitz, then to work in a factory, and then on a death march, which he survived. Now, my mother tells me that he never talked about the Holocaust until my grandmother died. He was silent all the years. She was talking and talking endlessly about Auschwitz, and he began talking only after she passed away. But this is what I remember. I remember the years he used to talk. And I have to say, and I have to be really honest about it, and it's very hard for me to say, but I simply couldn't listen. Because he didn't just talk, he was talking in a stream of conscience. It was a tsunami of words, of cry, of tears, of how he tried to manifest his life during the Holocaust, tell me about his family. He lost his entire family in the Holocaust. Only one brother survived, and then he was killed in the commemoration war in Israel in 1948. So he was left completely alone. And he was talking and talking, and as a child, I'm sorry, but I couldn't handle it, I couldn't bear it. So what I was doing, it's very hard for me talking about it, especially after Rachael. She spent the last decade dedicating herself to her grandmother's testimony. My God, I was such a lousy grandchild. But I was a lousy grandchild, and I couldn't handle it. And what I did is I developed what I now know was a defense mechanism. When I was sitting with him to the table, he was talking and talking and talking, and I was just sitting there, and I didn't hear a thing. I simply sealed myself. I built a mental wall between me and him. Again, I'm very sorry to say it, but this is the way it was. I simply couldn't handle it. And things changed for me only when I started university, and I went to the humanities department, and it was in my 20s, and I was looking for something that might interest me, and I couldn't find one. And then one day I had this window between two classes, and I saw that it was a course about anti-Semitism, and I decided to enroll reluctantly, but I did because I thought it was far enough. It didn't scare me. And after 1 hour and a half, I knew that that was that. Nothing is more interesting than that. It swept me off my feet completely. And since then, I've been researching the topic. In the last 25 years, I've written numerous articles and books about the topic. This is my entire life. I mean, it's not only work, it's not only career, it is part of me. It's in my veins, it's in my blood. And I want to share a screen, if I may, to show you a bit about my research. And these are the 4 books I've written. I'll talk about the 5th in a minute. And they discuss Holocaust commemoration in Israel over the years, from the 40s until the present. And they discuss politics and cinema and also humor. And my last book, which is, I love all my books, but this is the one closest to me, is about my generation, our generation. And it's titled Remaking Holocaust Memory. And it's about the documentary cinema of 3rd generation in Israel. And in the book, I've analyzed 19 prominent Israeli documentaries that reflect key tendencies of 3rd generation documentaries. And I've compared them to their cinematic parents, meaning 16 Holocaust documentaries by 2nd generation documentaries. And I wanted to explore how my generation, the filmmakers from my generation, are both affected by and deviate from their cinematic parents. So before I talk a bit about my book, I want to show you the illustration that I chose for the cover. This illustration appeared in one of the mainstream newspapers in Israel. It's called Yediot Achronot. And the minute I saw it, I said to myself, this has to be the cover of my book. And I've approached a very talented illustrator, Yotam Fishbein, and he agreed, and it became the cover of my book, because I believe this illustration epitomizes what I feel, what most of us feel, is when the grandchild sits in front of the grandmother and she says, I hope you won't run out of memory. And he says, don't worry, grandma. And I love this play on words, this double meaning, because she means the camera won't run out of memory, but he means that, yes, we are the custodians of memory. It is this double meaning. So this is the cover of the book. And when I was researching the films, I've realized that there are 5 topics that our generation diverts from the 2nd generation. 5 topics that are the focus of these films and are different from the focus of the films before. And I'll just go over it very quickly. First of all, gender. 2nd generation documentaries almost didn't discuss gender. They didn't discuss the different experiences of women during the Holocaust. They simply addressed the tragedies in one way or another. And I've realized that the 3rd generation documentaries put much larger focus on topics like pregnancy, abortion, sexual abuse was not even heard of before, and of course, the Holocaust effects on motherhood. These are things that appear in third generation documentaries. Another topic is Germany, and this again, it totally changes the way Germany is represented, because until third generation documentaries arrived, Germany was simply the absolute evil. It was obvious Germany is the absolute evil, but third generation documentaries, I would use the word dare to represent Germany in another way. They dare to talk about Germany as a beloved homeland for Holocaust survivors, and even as a place for grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. There is a trend nowadays of young Israelis moving to Berlin, and they analyze part of it. Another topic is the victim's testimony. For the second generation, the victim testimonies was sacred. Whatever the survivor said, this was the absolute truth, and this is how it was represented. And what happens in third generation documentaries is that in a very, very gentle way, they deal with the complexity and the elusiveness of survivor testimonies. These are themes that appeared in research, but were well aware only to Holocaust researchers. And now they bring it to the popular public and to discuss this elusiveness of testimonies. And another theme is the image. Second generation films used images from World War II. Just as, you know, parts of the films, this is how World War II looked like, this is how Berlin looked like, and so on. But third generation turned the image into one of the topics, and they analyzed the image, asking very difficult questions. For example, when we approach a propaganda film, a Nazi propaganda film, is it all a lie, or can we find some bits and pieces of truth within it? So these are the questions that they ask. And the last topic, which is very, very interesting, is the way third generation, again, dare to explore perpetrators, bystanders, and both these groups' descendants. Now here it is very, very clear that second generation documentaries are inner dialogue. Cayle talked before about the differences between second generation and third generation. The pain caused the films to be an inner dialogue between the children and their parents. They couldn't see anything else. And here, when we move to the next generation, to the third generation has the ability to look to the other side, to the forbidden side, and ask, wait a minute, what about the bystanders? What about the bystanders' children? What about the perpetrators' children? Can be called second generation and third generation as well? Can we feel empathy towards them? They didn't commit the crime. They are the children and grandchildren of a Nazi. Can we feel something towards them? And these are the questions that they raise in their films. So in the book, I've discovered that the third generation documentaries create a new layer of commemoration, which coexists with the former layer of commemoration. What second generation documentaries did was very, very important, constructing this layer of commemoration. And now the third generation, my third generation, is constructing a new thematic, moral and aesthetic recollection of the trauma. And in so doing, they extend the nature of Holocaust representation, recollection, and awareness, and not just in Israel. And this is very important because these films are broadcasted worldwide. They appear in festivals, they are being bought by TV stations all over the world. So it's not only in Israel, it's all over. And if you want to learn a bit more about my research, this is my site. I don't discuss there my personal biography. This is what I tell only, how many are we? 300 of my closest friends, which I've never met, which is you, you know. But in the site, it's only my research. And by the way, since I'm using this webinar as a group therapy, maybe by the end, you will all have to say, we love you, Liat. And so this is it.
Thank you so much. So I just want to ask you, how do you think attitudes in Israel towards the Holocaust affect this or inform this 3G storytelling? Because I know it's a society that is so permeated with Holocaust sentiment and interest, and it cuts across all demographic groups, religious, non-religious, Ashkenaz, Sephardi. So can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, exactly. And I took a picture of this week's newspaper for you in order to explain, because we've discussed these things in the preliminary talks before this conference, and I mentioned in my research, and I'm telling it over and over again, Israel is a unique sphere of Holocaust awareness. There isn't any community in the world that lives through such an intense Holocaust awareness. It has to do with the fact that we learn about the Holocaust from kindergarten until we finish high school. Small children at the ages of 3, 4, 5 stand in a siren on Holocaust Remembrance Day. When we are in high school, tens of thousands of high school students go on a week's trip to the former concentration camps. Then we learn about it in through our military draft and so on, and it's everywhere. Research indicates that our educational fields, cultural, media, whatever you want, public sphere, are all drenched in Holocaust awareness, in which the Holocaust is represented as something that didn't happen in the past. It didn't happen in the past and ended somewhere else, but it's as if it's happening right now. And I took this picture of this ordinary newspaper in the middle of the week just to show you what I mean. This is Yediot Achronot newspaper, one of the most mainstream newspapers in Israel. And as you go through the newspaper, this is your ordinary day. This is not Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's not nothing. It's a couple of days ago. And this is the centerfold of the newspaper, which means the most important place besides the headlines. So we have 3 main articles. So the first is about an IDF soldier, a flight, who flew over Dachau because his grandfather was an inmate in Dachau, and now he flew his plane over Dachau to show the Israel resilience and the fact that Israel was born after the Holocaust and is such a victory. Next to it, you can see an article about an anti-Semitic attack in the heart of Berlin, and next to it, the daughter of the mayor of Lvov is saying the Jews are carrying disease. Okay, this is the centerfold of your medium mainstream newspaper in the middle of the week. It's always there. It's always with us, and we cannot compare it to anywhere place in the world, anywhere other in the world, any other place in the world. And I think it has to do a lot with the political situation and the security situation. Because when we live from war to war, from intifada to intifada, from one operation to the other, it's very easy to make us conscious all the time, anxious, and the anxiety is very, very hard among Israelis. Some are less, some are more, but it's always there, this anxiety from the second Holocaust. And I must say that our politicians know how to use it, and they politicize the Holocaust and increase this anxiety by explaining us that if we're not careful, if we don't learn how to defend ourselves, then second Holocaust is about to arrive any minute.
Thank you. And also, I'm going to ask you this question, but I'm also going to pose this question to the other panelists. Do you feel, as I also detected, that there was a generational shift in terms of how we portrayed the Holocaust that occurred around the early 1980s because of films like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and because of the Demjanjuk trial, that things just kind of opened up, and we went from a culture of shunning and stigmatizing the survivors to celebrating them openly and wanting to learn more about their stories. So I'd just like to get your ideas on that.
Yeah, tremendously. And it's amazing because even though Israel is a unique sphere of Holocaust awareness and Canada is a different sphere, the United States is a different sphere, we all turn to the 80s as time of change. This is like a watershed for Holocaust commemoration, and I think it has a lot to do with the second generation. Because in the 80s, there are many other reasons, I don't have time to explain of them, technology is one of them, and other reasons, but when the second generation, in the 80s, they were around their 30s, their 40s, and they began to create. And you see this massive stream of creation, you see literature and graphic novels and films and so on. So it was the second generation who completely, again, in addition to other reasons, who completely changed the way we perceive the Holocaust. We perceive Holocaust survivors in a way they fought their parents' war. They've regained their lost dignity through their creation. You find it everywhere around the world, not only in Israel. But yes, the 80s is the time, right?
Thank you so much, Liat. We'll get back to you in a minute, but Ricki, I'd like to move on to you. Thank you for waiting patiently. So just curious, are you the grandchild of survivors?
No, I'm not.
So how did you get pulled into this?
So I've always been interested in the Holocaust. I was a history major, and it's very interesting to me how something like this could have happened in such a, industrialized modern society like Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And I went on March of the Living in 2013 with Rachael, who spoke earlier, and it really piqued my interest even more. And then I was working as a news producer at CTV, which is a Canadian broadcasting company. And this story came up about a 94-year-old former SS officer goes on trial in Germany for the murder of 300,000 people. And my first thought, well, he's guilty, no question. Then the more I kind of read about the case and him specifically, I thought, wow, there's just a lot more to unpack here. It's not quite that black and white and that cut and dry. And I thought a documentary might be a great place to look at all the moral and legal issues that not only surround the case, but the trial and prosecution of former SS officers, which took me down a whole rabbit hole of the German judicial system, post-war German judicial system, and how inadequately they prosecuted those who were responsible for the murder of millions of people. There were over 100,000 SS officers, and the most shocking figure I have is that 124 of them served life sentences. That's it. And, there's a lot of reasons for that, which we get into in the film, but I just thought it was like really, really interesting that they were taking this person who's 94, who is a kind of a low-level SS officer, and punishing him now, rightfully so, but all his superiors had got off scot-free and lived their life kind of fully, exempt from justice and had great lives in Germany. Even some of them got pensions. And just also, I think it was just so complex that I was really drawn to it.
It's very interesting. So how did you feel when you were making the film? Because it's pretty intense to go from not having grown up in that environment to then completely immersing yourself 24/7 in all things Auschwitz. So how did you feel and how did you cope when you were making this film?
So I grew up, I went to Jewish day school, so I had learned a lot about it. It wasn't like I was coming new to it. I think like some of our crew were new to it, especially the non-Jewish crew. So I think it was more shocking for them. Being at Auschwitz was quite shocking. But I had been there before with March of the Living. So I think I was actually more prepared than other people. And also the film, as much as it's centers on the crimes of the Holocaust, it's much more post-war film, like about the post-war judicial system and how one is deemed to be an accomplice in war crimes.
So it's very interesting. Do you want to share a clip from the film just so we can get an idea of what it's like?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
I know someone's asking about the film. It's called The Accountant of Auschwitz. So,
correct, The Accountant of Auschwitz,
yeah.
Yes.
So, this.
I did feel sympathy for him. He looked like a pitiful old man. But that all changed the moment he sat down and he put his arms like that. I thought, you are the same Nazi, the same person who thought you were gods and we were vermin.
Prosecutors in Germany have now charged a 93-year-old man who was the accountant at Auschwitz.
Oskar Gröning collected goods. He collected the luggage of the people that would be brought to Auschwitz. He would skim through the luggage for valuables.
The first day, 11 Holocaust deniers came and they shouted out loud.
In Auschwitz hat es keine Vergasung gegeben. Auschwitz war kein Vernichtungslager.
After the Second World War, the German system didn't fail to prosecute Nazi war criminals. It deliberately decided not to prosecute.
Of the 6,000 or 7,000 guards that went through Auschwitz, about 100 or so were prosecuted.
How are you today?
Good, thank you. I'm good, Oliver.
Then all of a
sudden, the prosecution in Germany changed the rules of the game.
There's slim pickings these days for Nazi war criminals. They got Gröning, they went after him.
If you punish a man of 93 for something that he did when he was 23, are you still punishing the person who did the crime?
I could tell there was not 1 ounce of meanness in his body.
This trial is a defining moment in the history of the Holocaust.
If we can send a powerful message that there is no statute of limitations on genocide, it could have an impact.
Yes, thank you. I encourage everyone to watch the entire film. So how did making this film end up forcing you to challenge your own moral assumptions?
So this film, which for those interested in watching it outside of Canada, you can catch it on Netflix. On Canada, it's at CBC Gem. The film really made me think about what makes someone an accomplice, and also the statute of limitations. This one line that Peter Singer says, Peter Singer is this moral ethicist, and he says it we put it in the trailer because it's so poignant. You know, when you punish a man who's 93 for something he did was 23, are you punishing the person who committed the crime? It got me thinking so much about, like, how do we judge whether someone's complicit? How do we judge whether he was following orders? He was, 18 at the time. He grew up in this world where he was indoctrinated at a very young age. Should he be held accountable, like, 75 years later, but he still participated in the crime and he still, has blood on his hands. So there's just so many, like, kind of complexities to it. And making this film, like, it really, I often get the question, like, what do you think, right? What do you think he should have been punished? And I'm so torn. It really depends on the day and what I watched or listened to that day. Because when I was making this film, like, you hear these survivor stories, and you just think anyone who was there should be, punished, no matter how old they are, But then on the other side, you hear, all these people who, like, we spoke to this woman who didn't make it into the film, who was a member of the Hitler Youth, and the way that they were brainwashed at that age. I'm not talking about someone who joins the Nazi Party at the age of 40. I'm talking someone who was born into it. So I just don't, I feel very torn. And I also feel like all his superiors, like, people who, like, truly poured Zyklon B into the gas chamber never faced any prosecution, whereas he was just this kind of low-level guard. He was on the ramp. So there's just, so many different moral and legal complexities here. So I'm not quite sure. I still am very torn. And I think this trial, like the trial of this man also can, and one of the reasons I was interested in making this film is because it has a modern day spin on the Holocaust and allows us to take what happened in the Holocaust and apply it to current war crimes that are being committed. How will we judge these war criminals that are active today? Will they be deterred knowing that a 94-year-old that at the age of 90 they could face prosecution? So, and I don't. Some people believe that. Many people who went along with it, who kind of pushed this case forward, really believed in deterrence. I'm not necessarily of that mind. I don't think that is going on the back of the mind of people who are currently doing kind of terrible things. But it's for the history books, and it allows both us to, the Holocaust was 75 years ago, and it's kind of fading from memory. So that a case that's happening now really gives us another opportunity to discuss it and to teach people about it. And I also think for survivors, it's nice to have that person being judged in a German courtroom. And it's in the history books that they were part of this. So that's, from my perspective, I think that that's kind of the benefit of having these trials, is more just like hearing from a perpetrator, not a survivor. And because, you know, people, Holocaust denier could be like, well, survive, and they often say this, like a survivor, you know, of course they would say, you know, what happened, and, you know, they're from there, who knows if they're telling the truth. But why would a perpetrator like Oscar Groening implicate himself? And he did. So there's a lot of value to hearing these trials and being witness to them.
It's very interesting. So I'm going to turn over the discussion to some of the questions that we have from our viewers, but I received a question from in advance from someone, which is something I'm sure that is on a lot of our minds and really colors the way that 3Gs see the Holocaust. And are we leaving the next generation with a sense that Judaism is disempowering and we are people who are perpetual victims? Or as 3Gs, because we have that degree of separation, are we able to take a more nuanced look at the Holocaust and say there were all kinds of different aspects involved? There was heroism, tremendous. I certainly look at it through the lens of rebellion. There were large acts of rebellion in terms of things like the Warsaw Ghetto and the partisans, but also smaller acts of rebellion, people maintaining their humanity in the face of brutality, survivors supporting each other, definitely people who try to maintain religious practice, often sacrificing their lives to smuggle in a siddur or a set of tefillin. These are small acts of rebellion. So I'm just wondering, do you think that as 3Gs, we are creating a new image, not of disempowerment and victimhood, but as survivors, as having been more in charge of their own personal destinies? So I'll pose the question to Liat first. So Liat, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah. First of all, yes, you can see in research that young researchers definitely talk about different ways of rebellion. It's not only being in the partisans or being part of the ghetto rival, but also trying to hide, trying to fly from one place to the other, helping one another in different small things that help to survive and so on. But I must say that it also goes the other way around, meaning I think we have the ability not to idolize the survivors, not to put them on a pedestal, but also to look at other things, more complex, more nuanced, problematic, like, for example, Jews who cooperated with the Nazis. It happened. It wasn't on a large scale, but it happened. And we have the ability to talk about it because we are much more sure of ourselves, and we know there is such a vast research about the Holocaust that we can talk about these things. We can also expose other things which were not so easily discussed before, and I said it before, like sexual abuse. The topic of sexual abuse arises in research and in documentaries from the 90s onward, but especially in the last decade. And this is the last decade because this is a new generation of researchers, of filmmakers who dare touch on this subject, which was almost a taboo. And women talk about it, and men who were sexually abused as well talk about it. And these are the nuance that this generation brings to the forefront. And I think it's very important. If it's on the better side, if it's on the worst side, we do present a much nuanced portrayal of the Holocaust.
Right. And so, Rachael, just wanted to get your feedback on that.
Sure. Well, I think that oftentimes we tell ourselves the stories that we need to hear. And I think right now, a lot of us are looking to figure out how to be empowered by our own history. So I do a lot of work with rescue missions. That's because my grandmother was rescued and she was the only survivor in her family at the end of the war, but she survived because strangers saved her life. So kindness is a huge theme for me. And for me, that's really helpful because looking at the world today, I find it to be a very overwhelming space. And I think that a lot of people are paralyzed by the desire to help those who don't who are threatened right now, and then figuring out how to do that. So for me, I find it to be really compelling and really important and urgent to look at all the small acts of kindness and how those save people's lives. But in addition, you can't look at a survivor story that's a bit more, I'll use the word gentle, as my grandmother had it, even though she was the only one in her family left at the end of the war, without understanding what was surrounding her. So the fact that she survived has to be partnered with the fact that her family was all exterminated in camps immediately. And so by looking at kind of the light and the dark, I think that we have a really interesting perspective. And being that the Holocaust is the most well-documented genocide from both the survivors and the perpetrators, we have a really unique opportunity to look at war and persecution from a much larger perspective. And I think it's really wonderful that different storytellers in this field are taking on different things. So for example, Ricki's film, I watched it this weekend because I'm working on a story that has to do with Nuremberg trials. And it was incredibly helpful for me to learn things that I don't personally study in my own, that doesn't come up in my grandmother's story. And so the diversity of narratives and the diversity of ways to look at this history, I just think are hugely helpful at understanding how complex it is. And it's awesome. It's great to be able to look at it from that way.
Absolutely, and I'd just like to mention that really everyone should read Liat's book, listen to Rachel's podcast, and watch Ricki's films. They offer 3 different, but yet similar in certain ways, perspectives. And Ricki's film in particular is chilling and just jam-packed with so much information that people may not have been aware of in the past. So just like to leave you with this last question. We have about 30 seconds per guest. Where do you see the future of Holocaust education heading, and what is the most effective means of transmitting these stories to future generations? So Rachel, go ahead. You're still on screen. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I've seen a few things come up in the chat of, educators asking, how do we make this feel relevant to high school kids and middle school kids? And so I think that's the big question, is how to tell this in a narrative space. I think that young people, or all people, we gravitate to stories, we learn from stories, we feel from stories, and it's not just passing down the information, but it's actually passing down the feeling of being victimized, but also the feeling of being rescued. And I think all of these things have to be infused into the storytelling moving forward, especially to make it feel relevant.
Right. Ricki?
I worry that, I've just been reading some of the comments and I agree with some of them. It's just, I worry that we're getting Holocaust fatigue because it's been, many, many years of films and documentaries. And as Rachel said, it's the most documented genocide in history. And so how do you keep young people interested? And how do you keep it, I hate to use a word, but relevant to them, right? I think it's a real challenge. I think it's a real challenge nowadays. And I don't know, I know with our film, one of the ways we try to do that is to use this modern trial that was taking place right now. So it would make it today, not, 75 years ago. But I think that there's some great initiatives. The Shoah Foundation is doing these holograms that allows survivors to go into schools after they've passed and, have Q&As with kids. I think that's amazing. But I do think we as a community really need to figure out how to keep it on the forefront without, making young kids roll their eyes oh, I've heard this 1,000 times. I've heard every story there is to hear, I don't want to hear about it anymore. So that's just, it's a challenge.
Liat?
This is a very complex topic. I cannot answer in 2 minutes, but I'll just say one thing. Embrace the new technologies. Embrace the digital world. And for all you educators out there, check out Eva Stories on Instagram. Check out Anna Frank's video, YouTube. It's from Anna Frank's house in Amsterdam. These are 2 very, very interesting projects which try to make it, and I know this word is horrible, Ricki, you're right, but try to make these stories relevant to the new generations. I think they're doing a very good work for people who are not familiar with the story in a way that can keep them interested. And I'm sorry, but we have to talk about these things because these are new generations. They have different things in mind. They are digital generations, and we have to embrace it. Otherwise, we're going to lose them, and we're going to lose the story.
Thank you so much. So we could continue all day, and truly this is not the end, this is just the beginning. I really urge all of our viewers to continue this discussion in their families and in their communities. And if you'd like to find out more about our panelists' work, you can go to either 3G New York's website or our resource page, and also to Liberation75. And I urge all of you to sign up for our events and our email updates. And I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their time with us today and their thoughts and their work. And I would especially like to thank Marilyn Sinclair from Liberation75 and Jessica Sinclair, who really poured their hearts into this event. And to David Wax, the president of 3GNY, and to all of you for spending this hour with us. We truly appreciate it. And so I'd like to see you all hopefully at some of our future Zoom events. And I'd like to wish all of you a very sweet and happy Shana Tova Tikatevu V'Tichatemu. And I look forward to seeing all of you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.